Cheers. Thanks for that. Yeah, my name's Albert Mullen. Just an introduction. I worked on a dairy farm on my home farm for 40 years, and then we changed over to beef cattle. We had 1,200 acres, and I got a job with the government in forestry at that time, and then that was plantations, then went to Landcare, Catch Management Authority, and then now into LLS. And we suffered a drought many times over those years, and I said 40 years. Obviously, you can work out my age. I've been off the farm for 20 years, but you know, if you're born on a farm, you're sort of a farmer from the day you're born, so you always get a job from the time you're about 3 or 4 years old upwards, I suppose. But yeah, I was talking to Dad the other day about the last drought we had, and Dad's always been telling me that the 64 drought at Gloucester was the worst drought he'd ever encountered, and we had many droughts after that in the 80s and 90s, but the 64 one was the worst one. And I said, oh look, I think this drought's going to beat your 64 drought. It's pretty dry out there. And I had 80 cows and calves and destocked down to 20 cows and calves because I was looking at ground cover basically and said, well, I can't support those 80 cows. I've got to get rid of them. So my idea in a drought is to stay in control of the drought and don't let it control you and what you do, and get into a hand feeding system where you basically spend all your saved money on feeding animals that might not survive, or you have to, as Louise said, sell at the end anyway and not recoup your money. And anyway, Dad said, oh, well, I was running out of water like everybody, and he said, well, there's a bit of water out in the back corner under this tree, and Dad's 92, he hadn't been out there for a while, so I went out to the back corner under this tree, and here was a puddle of water there. And at that time I thought, well, back in 1964 he would have been in this same spot looking at that same puddle of water I'm looking at today. So I think the connection between people is an important thing when you are faced with some adversity, and I know you guys have faced more than your own fair share up here, so I think it's good to stay connected, talk to people about what you're experiencing, other people that have experienced exactly what you've experienced, because they're the ones that know about it. And it could be one small thing they say to you that gives you a bit of, to keep on going. So I'd encourage you to stay connected with your communities and keep going, because, that connection with my father and that little talk about the water hole, even though I'd put water troughs since then through the whole property and I was pretty okay for water, it was still good to have that connection and have that conversation. Today I've been tasked with giving you guys a talk on grazing management, and I suppose grazing management is an important part of your farm plan, and I think I see some maps in front of you today, and I think the farm plan is the most powerful thing you can do. And it's more about your thinking process, about what you're going to draw on that farm plan and where you're going to put your paddocks, etc. So I think where you put your paddocks and the strategies you put behind where you put your paddocks and how you set them up will get you through and keep you in control of your farm rather than the farm sort of controlling what you do. So there's a heap of different things you need to consider, and that is fencing location, your water resources, to flood prone land, your loss of production and all those sort of things, and they decide what you're going to do with that area, even weed control. So I know there's a lot of smaller farms here, some people haven't got cattle, but you can adapt these things to what you have and size, and you can manipulate what you have. So I might go to the next one, thanks. Next slide. So I suppose I'm talking about a productive system, and I like to make sure that even if people have got 5 or 10 animals, they're still productive and they still make you a bit of income, and that you don't spend your income just keeping those animals alive. So I suppose it's about, fencing paddocks, the type of paddocks you fence, the type of aspect they're on, and the type of slope you're looking at, and that determines your paddock size, and the paddock size also determines your stocking rate. So you can manipulate your stocking rate by the paddock size you have, not by the animals you have. So we'll go through that in a minute. So I think that the more paddocks you have, the more options you have, especially if you congregate those paddocks in specific strategies. So it's okay to draw squares on a map and say that's a paddock, but you need to put a strategy behind it and have that in your head. A primary strategy and a secondary one. The primary strategy might be pasture improvement, the second strategy might be fire protection.
Next one
Next one, thanks. So this is a sort of a strategy on a broad area of land, and I suppose I'm not giving you this is what you have to do. These are just concepts you can think about on your place, and no matter what the size. So on the upper slopes, generally they're the type of slopes you put in your larger paddocks. They're the most expensive to improve because you can't get machinery on those paddocks, and it's a different class of animal you might put up there. It might be cows, bullocks, those sort of things that can handle the type of grasses that generally grow up there. Native grasses, older grasses that have allowed to grow to seed heads, and that you can't control the grazing as much. But you can still rotate around those paddocks and use your animal to do your machinery work you might do on the other slopes. So you would still set up a range of paddocks there that you'd rotate those cattle through. And it's amazing what sort of job they do. You can actually visually see, if you can keep your cattle in an area for a couple of weeks, the amount of grazing and weed control they actually do. Mid-slope areas, you probably get your tractor over a lot of that, or whatever your machinery you're using. You can start doing a bit of pasture improvement, intensify your grazing, use your paddock size to increase your stock numbers, and manipulate the greenness in your pasture. In those upper slopes, they're probably browsing that pasture, they're getting the greenness out of it by selection, but down in the mid slopes you can really control how well you keep the greenness and the leafy matter of those pastures by the density of the stock and your paddock size. On the lower slopes, around your river flats, and everybody's got small creek flats or whatever else, this is where you can really increase your production. Yes, you can use fertilisers to do that, and this is where you can finish stock. This is where you want to, finish stock in a month or so, finish them off for the sale yard or wherever your market is, or do some storage of feed there by making silage or whatever else. So that's and then your intensity is increased, tenfold compared to the other slopes. So I suppose there are grass ID books out there, and identifying the grasses on your property helps you work out on your farm plan where the production is coming from. So if you can look on the right of that wheel, you've got all your better type grasses, your paspalum, kikuyu, kangaroo grass, soteria and those types of species, where if managed properly, can provide your animals with the energy they need to gain weight or maintain their body condition. But on the left-hand side are the other grasses that probably aren't as good as doing that, or actually if you had them set on those, they might actually lose weight, and then you're into a supplementary feeding program which is costing you money to maintain the animals in those areas. So therefore, when you look at your farm plan, you've got to decide what percentage of my farm is productive and what percent isn't, and then try and manipulate that by grazing. So you can increase the area of the better grasses on your property and therefore reduce the need for supplementary feeding. So instead of having 100 acres of productive land, the real estate person told you might only have 50 acres or 30 acres. And it's your job to then manipulate those pastures through grazing to try and increase the native pastures or some of the naturalised pastures. I'm happy to come out. It's great to get out of the office and come out and visit farmers. I've done a couple every week for the last couple of months. So my card's out there, give us a call. No matter what size you are, I can come out and we'll just run through your paddocks and have a look at some strategies and give you an idea and have a look over your farm plan, and so we can, you get someone from the outside looking at your place. You see it every day, so it's good to get another opinion. And it's an opinion, so you don't have to take it on. It's your property. You do what you like with it. So it's just some ideas. Next one, thanks. So this is from our drought and supplementary feed and it's just to prove about that whole digestibility of grasses. So the late flowering type grasses only got 45% digestibility, and your animals can only intake about 3 kilograms of that grass a day when it needs about 15 or so. So it's only providing 29% of that animal's diet for the day. The animal can't physically process the energy in that pasture to give it enough to maintain its body weight on that day on that type of grass. And it's the same if you buy hay that's not green hay or silage that's made of ceteria. You want to use that as supplementary feeding, then you're actually going to starve that animal and it'll lose weight on that stuff, especially if you've got no green in the paddock as well. So you've got to be very careful when you're buying in feed in a grass type feed to make sure you assess it before you buy it to see what energy it has in it, because the energy is what you need to produce weight. On the other side, you've got a grass that's active growing, short, leafy. It provides 85% of the diet for that animal. So I think this app's pretty conservative. I think it would provide 100% of the maintenance diet, plus you'd be able to gain some weight on an active growing pasture. So that's the difference in maintaining a stock rotation to control the height of grasses, so you keep the energy in the system, even if you have to leave a few paddocks to grow out to go to seed, and you reduce the amount of paddocks your cattle are working in and the size they're in, so they can actually effectively graze it to maintain the greenness in the pasture. The growth phase, yes. But there again, if you had blady grass and you slashed down and it came up green, there are different energy values in different grasses as well. And blady grass, even though it comes up green, it's probably got as much energy as a carton of beer. They have tested in the lab, and I think the carton of beer won as far as energy goes in cardboard. No, just the carton, the beer's in the cardboard. So that's the lab people drink the beer, don't you? I thought that'd be obvious. Go. The next one, thanks.
So sorry, where do you access that app from?
Yeah, it's on. You just get it on your app store on your phone. It's free. It's a drought and supplementary feed app the DPI put out. And there's a drought feeding app as well. There's two of them. The supplementary feeding app takes into account pasture. So these are some of the things we use to measure pasture and try and get the best out of it. If you can't visually recognise it, so it's a plate meter or a ruler. I've got some rulers and I can come out to your place and show you how to use the ruler. It can estimate how much dry matter in that paddock. Then you can work out what animals you're going to apply to that area. You can work out how many days they'll be in there for to effectively graze that, and then move on to the next pasture. You can set up a sort of a pasture program. I think that if you've got a range of paddocks you're going through, you should be ahead of the old cattle or animals, a couple of weeks looking at that pasture, measuring it, see how it's growing, and then decide which paddock they need to go into next. It's not a consequential thing of 1, 2, 3 paddocks we're going through. It might be 1, 3 and then 2. So because all grasses grow at a different rate at a different time of year. So this is where a lot of people said they had weed problems, and if you have got weed problems in the paddock, I suppose when I was on the farm, we were in an upper catchment, brush country, you had a lot of woody weeds, lantana, tobacco bushes, bracken fern, all these sort of things. And I generally use my pasture improvement program to control weeds in those paddocks. So it would be a year of an annual type pasture through the winter time. Your winter coldness in the winter is a good thing for controlling weeds. It slows their growth down, and the ryegrass pasture model loves the cold weather, and then that sort of cleans the weeds. Your paddock, your cattle are grazing that area. You're adding nutrients to that area, so it's encouraging the weeds the grasses to improve their ground cover. And then after you've done that for that year, coming into the next autumn, then you apply your perennial grasses that you want in that paddock along with your winter pasture as well. And then you slowly transition into a perennial pasture if it's kikuyu, Rhodes grass, paspalum or ceteria, and then that will help you control paddock weeds, especially if they're annual weeds. And generally, there's going to be a talk later on about weeds, and the time you finish that talk, you'll be feeling pretty good about your weeds, because they do play a role in, you know, fixing your soil up. So I was at this pictures aren't fantastic, but I was at a farm yesterday having a look at his grazing management. He's been through one of our programs, and he started with a farm that didn't have much infrastructure in, and he's applied infrastructure in strip graze, fencing, winter pasture program, and he got through the drought okay. He still had to buy some cattle in, but he certainly got some really nice looking cattle at the moment. So I suppose the first top left-hand thing is just a pretty simple, cheap tape, pigtail post tread-in thing that's movable, that's easy to subdivide your larger paddocks into, you know, control your grazing densities. So the second slide, which hasn't, or that one on the left, the next one down, is a graze strip. And as you can see, it's a bit clumpy, but that's because some of it's, you know, a bit woody because it's gone to seed, this pasture. But that's grazed out. You know, I wouldn't leave the animals in there any more to try and graze that down further, because they've done their job there, and you move them on. And maybe you might have to top it or something with a tractor later on to improve the greenness of that pasture. The one next to it on the right, I think that's gone too far. Like, I wouldn't bother stripping that paddock because it's gone to head, it's senesced, and there's not a lot of energy in there, and maybe that's a paddock you leave out of the rotation. You just let that go to seed over this period of time, and then that might come back for you in the winter if you haven't got enough stock to control all your pastures, because there's been a burst of pasture growth in this last little while, and what you're really trying to do is maintain a nice green leafy paddock. So you would then reduce your rotation paddock numbers and concentrate the animals you have in lesser paddocks to keep the greenness of that pasture going. I'll just go back. Another handy thing I saw he had was that trough in the middle. He's got located there. You know, he's got 2-wire electric over the top of it, but the cattle can, you know, get water on both sides, so he's using the trough for 2 paddocks instead of just one. That's reducing his costs, but there's also another thing about that trough on the right. You might, bottom on the right, that's a turf valve. So he can unplug that trough out of the turf valve and then move it with his quad bike to the next paddock. So he's only using one trough for his whole property, which is an expense because troughs are about $1,000 each. So if you can use one multiple times, and he moves that along with his cattle as he rotates around his farm and just plugs into the turf valve. Next one, thanks. So just talking about the weed control, this is a kikuyu paddock, and kikuyu is a great weed control thing. And if any dense pasture, you skip one. Any dense pasture is good for weed control, and this is what you need to try and get going over the next couple of years after you've had it just burnt off. It's trying to get that grass growing back in those open paddocks so you can control the weeds into the future. And any dense pasture, whether native grass pasture with kangaroo grass or whatever else, is a good thing, and you manipulate that by your stock management. So you might allow your native pastures to go to seed fairly extensively in this next couple of years while they're being damaged by fires to help them regenerate really quickly. And you know, you'll have to put your stock somewhere else on better pastures like kikuyu to get them through this year. And kikuyu and a ryegrass mix is a very resilient pasture, and it will get you through winter and help you not have to buy so much supplementary feeding in if you can put a ryegrass in with your kikuyu pasture in around April. So that will cost you about 12 cents a kilogram dry matter if you control the grazing properly. If you don't control the grazing properly, it could cost you 50 cents a kilogram dry matter if you only get one feed off it. So this grazing management is starting to get really important to your operation, and it's important because you've made a farm plan up and organised your paddocks, and you know in your mind what grasses you have in each paddock and what you need to do to manipulate those grasses with your grazing to improve your ground cover and your production and save yourself some money. Also, your riparian areas and tree lots are also part of your grazing plan. So cattle can access those areas to control weeds at times, not many times through the year, but you can use your cattle to control some weeds in these areas, even if it's just to trample the weeds in a short amount of time for you to help come in behind them and help control weeds. Also, it gives protection for young trees to grow and then provide your windbreaks or shade or whatever else. So those areas that you might be working on your farm plan is also important to integrate into your paddock rotation and farm plan, so you know where to put these things. And I generally wouldn't put them where you can grow good pasture. There's plenty of other locations you can put trees and things like that that aren't your productive areas of your property. So flood prone areas, sorry. You probably say, I'm not putting a fence there near my river because a flood's going to come soon and it'll just take all that work away. So I'm saying, well, fence on the high bank. Use that flood prone area. It's going to be a flatter area. Use that as one of your productive paddocks. You might make your silage and stuff out there, or you might strip graze. And if you're going to strip graze it, you're going to put up temporary fence there anyway, and you'll temporarily fence the river off at that time when they're in there. So that's the way to manage a flood prone area without putting a hard fence in there that you might have to then buy back every 2 or 3 years or replace. So that's another cost saving measure you can implement by using just temporary fencing, single wire. If you're rotating cattle around all the time, they're going to get pretty quiet, and a single wire fence electrified you'll be easily be able to maintain the area they're in with that sort of strategy. So I was at the place yesterday where all those other fences were, you just had that single skinny tape in, and 40 cows and 20 heifers that were pretty towy from another place he bought in, and they didn't go across the fence, and we had people around and everything, and we run them through these little laneways and that electric fencing, and they never went through these fences. So really cheap way to do it, reuse, etc. And then these just erosion areas. I was going to talk about erosion later, but once you get erosion by low ground cover and all these sort of things and no roots in your system, even if they are weeds, then you are going to lose that area land forever. There's no turning back from erosion. Once you get in that subsoil, there's no good grasses going to grow in there into the future. They're very hard to bring back to how it used to be. My neighbour had cleared that steep hill, and that was a really nice creek down there with trees around, and it's all gone now. The sediment's full in the creek and turned into rivulets. So these are the sort of things overclearing can do, or low ground cover can do. Water's another important thing. Once you start, subdividing your paddocks, then you've got to have water in each paddock. And I suppose in the last drought, everybody learnt that dams are problematic with supplying good quality water. When you have a number of stock, on a water point for a number of days, it soon turns turbid, and then it's gone for the whole drought. So you can't use that water again. So there's solar pumps out now that are fairly reasonably priced. They work pretty well, and they pump a long way. I've got one at my place that pumps 400 metres. It's 80 metre head, the same as that one there in the picture, and you can put a water trough up in the upper reaches of your landscapes up on hilly country, where you then can graze effectively. Cattle will graze a couple of 100 metres away around a water point, so you can graze effectively in that area and get a more uniform grazing to once again manipulate pasture and control its growth, so you can remain productive. So this is my farm. It's up in the Upper Wollamba catchment. It feeds into the Wallace Lake. It's an ex-dairy farm, and all the paddocks there are from that era. But I suppose if I had my wish list, then I would do this to it. So as you can see, I'd fence all the little water courses off with double fencing. That gives me a paddock subdivision. So instead of having one of those areas only having one paddock, now I've got 5. They don't have to be squared up. I'm just going to follow the little gully lines around. Once I come out of those incised gullies, I'll go into single fencing up in the hillier country to reduce my costs, but then still subdividing that area into different paddocks, and then supplying a water trough and stuff to those areas so I can manipulate and improve the grazing uniformity of the stock I have. So I have implemented a little bit of that plan, and when you put 80 cows and calves in 100 acres of land, it's amazing what they can do within a week. You can actually see it from another hill. You can look down and say, well, Jesus, you would have thought I took my tractor and slasher out and slashed all that hill country where I can't access, but the cattle can. So I suppose this is how I started off. Look at those plans you have, look at the paddock sizes. Think of your environment and where you can exclude stock from and how you can, make the most out of your country. And you have to be on your toes a bit. So you just don't sort of do your rotational grazing and keep going around and around and then forget about, your grass growth and what's happening there. And, you don't just keep your same stock numbers you have all the time, because that's what you need to do. I'm going to keep my 80 cows and calves no matter what, and I'm going to feed them. I've got 20, 30 cows now with heifer, keeping all the heifers, rebuilding my herd over years. But I've got money in the bank. I didn't go into debt in the drought. I've got good money in there, and I've got an option now. I can buy some in when the cattle prices settle down, and I kept control of it. I have been in a situation where I haven't kept control of it, and I had cows dying in the paddock because I didn't have control. My father did. So I've been through the couple of systems, and I've felt that I did okay this time compared to how we'd handled it in other times. Did you have a comment? No. Well, I always think of it. Someone said to me the other day, I'm not buying any heifers, they're too dear. And I said, well, hang on. You guys are always complaining that the stock prices, are the same 10 years ago, and now they're really good. You're complaining that they're too dear. Well, I asked a guy the other day, I said, how much money did you spend on your cows to get them through the drought so then you could have them when you're finished? He said, I think I worked out about $2,000 a cow. You could have sold them for $1,000, so that makes them $3,000. You can buy heifers now for $1,600. So did he keep control of the drought, or did the drought control him? So some people who used the app got away a bit cheaper than that. But then again, if they did lose condition, then are they going to go in calf this year? Because that upsets their reproduction as well if they lose condition and lose a lot of weight. So there's a lot of factors you have to keep on your toes about during a drought. And when we say destock, we don't say get rid of all your animals. We're saying do it in a sequential program over the months, looking at the weather, the outlooks, the forecasts, assess all your stocks for temperament and colour and everything else you can to start building another strategy around what you're going to end up at the end. So I had red and whites and Angus cattle, so I decided I was going to get out of the red and whites. So I sold every Hereford I had and kept all the black and whites. So that was my strategy, and that got me down to 25. So it's really good in your own mind if you've got a strategy and then you make a decision and do something, then you feel fine about it. It's a relief when they go out on the truck to wherever they're going. You might have liked them, but you've thought about it. You've got a strategy in your head, and you think you're doing the right thing. So I think it's important in this farm plan to build strategies and options and keep control. So this is what I think everybody should have, and it's a bulk feed bin. It's an old one, but it's a goodie, and we've had it for about 25 years. So I think I worked out it cost me around $50 a year to have on the place. You can buy bulk feed; it's cheap. You put it in your yards, and it's a great thing. It's good for early weaning, bulk buying grain. A couple of animals have lost a bit of weight. They surprised you one day. You went out in the paddock and there they were, and say, "I'll bring them into the feedlot and I'll feed them up there for a while." So it achieves a bit of peace of mind. It helps you run cattle in there, and then that's a transition spot where you move them off the farm and sell them, and all these sort of things. The truck turns up, drops it off for you. You got a couple of months of feed there. You got good water in the yards and everything else. Got a sick animal. It's handy to use all the time. I use it all the time. You can throw a bit of hay in it, supplement the diet, the grain-based diet. So it's a good thing to have on a farm. It's a good investment. I think that might be the end, is it? Anyway, that's the end. Is there any?